Hello and welcome everybody. I'm really excited for our guest today for our expert discussion. And this topic is, I think, on everybody's minds right now. There's a lot of stuff going on in our country and internationally that really challenge sometimes the founding fathers and the principles that they stood for. Today, I'm joined by an expert in this field, Chuck DeVore, who is the Vice President at Texas Public Policy Foundation, a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and a former Californian assemblyman. Thank you, Chuck, for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Thomas.
So today's topic is really centered around the Constitution. And as we talked to before we got onto the call, what is the essence of the founding fathers and what they meant when it comes to rights around the Constitution? So this is a really deep policy question. And as Chuck pointed out, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to it in 35 minutes, but we're going to do our best to unpack it for you guys. And the important thing here is what I want to really understand and unpack is what's the difference between being empowered by the Constitution and being entitled. Use the Constitution as a weapon to make maybe my agenda go through or my voice to be louder. What is the difference between being empowered, in your opinion, and maybe using it to be entitled?
Well, it goes back to natural law and the initial concept of rights as the founders saw them. This is based, of course, on extensive writings going back certainly to the ancient Greeks, to Aristotle, to Locke, and this concept that because we're all human and all created in God's image, that we all have certain unalienable rights, that these rights are, of course, enumerated in the preamble to the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for this reason, governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. And so that was the concept of the founding, you could say the mission statement of the United States at its creation in 1776. And then the whole purpose of the Constitution was to better realize these rights, however imperfectly they were experienced then and perhaps still today. But it was to make sure that these God-given rights that we have as individuals could be secured by our government, could be enjoyed by the individuals who were part of that. And so if you look at, for example, then the Bill of Rights that was put in as kind of an agreement, right? The first few states ratified the Constitution, but when it came to Massachusetts, where they had just been racked by Shays' Rebellion just a few months earlier, there was quite a concern that a strong, robust central government could be injurious to rights. And so under John Hancock and other leaders in Massachusetts, they recommended the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. So their approval, their narrow approval, by the way, of the Constitution's ratification, was contingent upon a passage of a Bill of Rights. And so if you look at the Bill of Rights, what to me is interesting, and this gets to the heart of your question, and unfortunately the terminology isn't particularly helpful for us because it doesn't sound very good, but the rights that were enumerated in the Constitution are what's known as negative rights. Now, what is a negative right? A negative right, put simply, is something that does not, accrue any sort of obligation upon you to help pay for or help me enjoy my rights. So, for example, the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms, does not obligate you to provide me with weapons and ammunition to enjoy my right. Similarly, the right to free speech does not obligate you to pay for example, a printing press for me or a megaphone. It simply obligates the government not to prevent me from enjoying my right to free speech or to petition redress of grievances to my government. Naturally, and it's important to understand here, that this is not, of course, an issue between private parties. In other words, my right to free speech does not obligate the Austin American Statesman to publish my op-eds as much as I wish they would. I can, however, try to start my own newspaper. In today's day and age, of course, there are interesting side discussions we can have about social media and to what extent social media is now some sort of a public square. but that perhaps can be left for another day. So those are negative rights. Those are what's in the Bill of Rights. Positive rights, you kind of see make their appearance, perhaps 100, 120 years ago with the advent of the progressives and the German school of philosophy that came to American shores around the 1880s. George Goodenow was a early practitioner of that. Woodrow Wilson really got its start with this. And you see it with Theodore Roosevelt in I think it was, what was it, the five freedoms, the four freedoms, whatever it was during World War II. Included among those were like, the right to have a job, right for housing, and these other things. You started to see this drift into positive rights, meaning that your enjoyment of that right is going to incur an obligation on your fellow citizens to help pay for that right. And that becomes problematic because at the end of the day, what that means is you are claiming a levy on my time, on me, to provide you with something. So for example, healthcare. If I was a doctor, and let's say because of increasing centralization of healthcare, fewer and fewer people want to practice medicine, and let's say we get to the point where there's a huge shortage of doctors. Well, if healthcare is a right, then you could have the government essentially draft doctors into government service and force them to provide this thing that has now been declared a right to people who should be enjoying this right. Make sense?
100%.
And so I think that kind of gets to the heart of what you're talking about empowerment versus entitlement. I think that kind of serves as a good foundation for the rest of our discussion.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. It's interesting to think about rights in terms of negative and positive. And I think that's it can be fundamentally missed sometimes. When you think, we can take it from the top if we really want to here and say, let's say free speech has been much of not just this discussion, but much of the focus since, I would say, 16. And the reason I keep focusing on 2016 when Donald Trump was running is that a lot of stuff bubbled up then. It was not just because of him, it's just because it was the time for, and free speech was the focus. I have a voice, I'm going to use it online, I'm going to use the megaphone, and I'm going to go out into the actual public square and demonstrate that on both sides of the aisle. And Jordan Peterson has a very interesting stance on this. He goes, you can do anything you want, just don't superimpose it on me. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. And I think that's a very reasonable way to go about it. So my next question, when do we cross that line from you can do whatever you want, and then it starts being an imposition? And what are some of the effects, both maybe negative and maybe positive, of when that happens? And when I say positive, for those listening at home, when somebody crosses that line, does that discourse open the conversation further? It might not be right, but does it open the conversation further? So I'll leave you with the floor to kind of answer when we start seeing that become a problem and maybe showing us some benefit.
Well, I think it's very important for your viewers to understand that, of course, we've had protest movements in America from our very founding. And in fact, the war for our independence was really an armed protest movement to, in many people's eyes, assert our rights as Englishmen, these rights that have been abridged by the King and Parliament. If you then look through, for example, in more recent times with the civil rights movement, what you'll see is a combination of protests both against government, where the government was abridging our citizens' rights under the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, to fully realizing, fully enjoying their rights. Separate but equal was certainly not equal. And to the extent that government was imposing these Jim Crow laws that were being resisted by protests, many of which on the surface you could argue, well, that's a violation of the law. They're violating the peace, right? The public peace and order.
Mm-hmm.
But the protests, of course, were in service of a larger cause of justice. And sometimes these protests took place in private establishments, whether it was privately run bus lines or restaurants that may have been enforcing segregation. And so again, technically, sheriffs could certainly go in and arrest some of those individuals, and they did. And those individuals paid an individual price for their protest. But in so doing, they raised their issue to the nation, and they helped set the stage for significant reforms in American law, certainly at the state level and at the federal level, and ultimately accomplished their objective. And so what I would argue in that case, though, is what was the objective? Their objective was, as we certainly heard repeatedly from Dr. Martin Luther King, was to have full enjoyment of their natural rights as Americans, to be treated just like everybody else. Yeah. And so it's also important to understand that who were they being repressed by? They were being repressed by their own governments that weren't living up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. As again, Martin Luther King said, it was a promissory note to future generations that someday they might too enjoy fully these freedoms. And so I think that's one example of historical protests that certainly had consequences for those who protest, jail time, sometimes death and injury. But what they were aiming for was a complete and full enjoyment of the rights that we all expect as Americans as our birthright, our natural rights, our liberty that has been granted to us by our Creator. Now, if you go to more recent times and look at some of these protests and certainly some of the violence or looting, you begin to see kind of a different sort of quest, a quest that would say, America is fundamentally flawed. And by the way, this is at the highest level, giving them the benefit of the doubt of having a coherent ideology that most of the participants agree with and understand, as opposed to just participating in an orgy of violence for fun or for personal gain and profit. And so the theory goes that because the U.S. is irredeemably evil and flawed from the start, and because certain people, by dint of their immutable characteristics, typically race or ethnicity, are either oppressors or oppressed, then that leads to the inevitable conclusion that we must use the power of government to take from one group and give to another group. And of course, when government is involved in taxation, if you don't pay, there's always the implicit threat of violence to take what has been demanded of you. And if you don't want to pay, you can be arrested and you can spend a lot of time in federal prison for federal tax evasion. So I think that what you have to look at is you have to look at what is the objective, what is the ultimate aim of the people who are protesting. Is it the complete enjoyment of their natural law rights as people? And if here's the test: does the complete agreement of those rights, does it incur an obligation on you or anyone else to pay to allow those individuals to fully enjoy those rights? If the answer to the question is yes, then in all likelihood, they're not seeking enjoyment of their rights. They are demanding entitlements. They are demanding something that isn't theirs to demand.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this goes back to the original question. And thank you for that, historical outline. It was great. I mean, I'm taking notes. Actually, this is really great, and so I know everybody's really going to enjoy this. What a great perspective to, come back from the founding to now. And so that goes back to the root of the question: the entitlement versus empowerment. The entitlement really is triggered, like the catalyst or the linchpin, if you will, is when I'm imposing or requiring somebody else to do something in reaction to what I would consider my rights. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I think in general, although again, rights would, of course, have to be in air quotes, because it's not your right to require me to pay higher taxes
Right.
so that you can live in a house or have a car. Those are not fundamental rights. They're nice things to have.
Yeah.
And I certainly wish every American who wished to have shelter would have shelter. But it is certainly not a human right. It's a human right to when you manage to obtain your shelter, to not have somebody else come and take it from you by threat of force, and just take what is yours. Obviously, that's important, that we be secure in our property.
Sure. Well, let's take freedom of speech, like we were talking about the riots. It's that moment where, like what you said a minute ago, it's that moment where the other person is required to give something up. Whether it's property, whether it's speech, whatever it is, that's when we kind of cross that line into a dangerous territory. And we saw a lot of policy, and we saw a lot of rhetoric. We saw a lot of stuff happen and I just in recent memory where I felt like, okay, we're entering. I can feel it. We are entering dangerous territory here. And I guess I'm sure people have felt that way for a long time, but it's this slow progression. And now more than ever, I think we really need to understand the difference between the two. So let's go, now that we've kind of defined entitlement and what that means, using the Constitution as like an entitled weapon. When I have to require somebody else to give something up, let's talk about empowerment. What are some of the ways you've seen in recent memory, and maybe your history recollection is great, where the Constitution has empowered people, and how that's different than the entitlement?
Well, I think perhaps the most clear example comes in the First Amendment. So the First Amendment, of course, has a few major components, right? You have freedom of the speech. Congress is not supposed to abridge that freedom. You have freedom of religion. You have freedom to peaceably assemble. And I guess the key word there is peaceably assemble.
Yep.
And then, and why do we have those? Among other reasons, to have the ability to have redress of grievances for our government. So in other words, being able to address your government and say, I think that this is wrong. I've been either wronged, or this law needs to be changed. We can do better. And so that process, that petition, these days, of course, takes many forms. You could visit with your elected representative. You can email them. You can put a phone call into her office. You can send a letter. And you can maybe show up at a town hall. You can even run for office yourself. Mm-hmm. And these are ways that you can petition redress of grievances. And so in that sense, then, our government specifically empowers its citizens to have this mechanism by which they can be heard. Now, that's not exactly a common thing around the world. I had, when I was in the California State Assembly, there were some foreign nationals. They had green cards, or in some cases had become citizens, and their parents and their aunts had been arrested and held without formal charge in the People's Republic of China. And they kept trying to bring a letter, a petition, to the general consul, or pardon me, the consul general for the People's Republic of China in San Francisco, and that individual would constantly deny their ability to even have a discussion. They were essentially considered as non-people or subjects that he didn't have to listen to. And for a related reason, eventually I was able to meet with this individual in my office in Sacramento. And unbeknownst to him, I had invited some of the relatives who his government were holding incognito in these prisons and being subject to psychological warfare. And so after our 30-minute meeting, he left my office and was confronted with 3 individuals who were Chinese nationals who finally could provide their petition, their redress of grievances to this official. And subsequently, I was able to find out a few months later, some of the women were formally charged with a crime and then allowed to go to their house arrest. And so, you look at this and you think, that's a pretty stark difference, right? So here you have a high-ranking official who refused to even meet with their own citizens, people who had a concern, a problem with the government. And it took the intervention of a foreign elected official for them to enjoy what we would consider here in America a basic human right, a fundamental right that's guaranteed by the Bill of Rights in our U.S. Constitution.
That is powerful. And I'm sure there's hundreds of stories like that. And we don't hear them. Well, we don't hear them, I don't think, as much as we maybe need to. That's kind of like, the Constitution is like chocolate cake, and like what you just depicted is kind of like a vitamin.
Right.
It's kind of the information we kind of need to hear, not just to be thankful for the Constitution, but also to help others like what you did, and also to be that sounding board for somebody that's having trouble, and also to remember how valuable that founding is. So the empowerment is evident when it comes to foreign governments. Have you done any other work with foreign governments as your time on this planet, other than that you can point to as experience?
Well, perhaps nothing quite as dramatic, given that most of the other governmental entities would have been, allied or friendly governments, where I would argue that the enjoyment of their citizens' rights are perhaps not as clear or strong as we have here, but more or less they're in the same ballpark. So I don't think I have any other stories as moving as that. I think another good example of empowerment that may be perhaps a little more complicated or controversial, of course, is the rights provided under the Second Amendment of the Constitution. A lot of controversy. It was only just a few years ago in the Heller decision that the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment conferred an individual right to keep and bear arms. And so, again, you have to go back and you have to look at the history of why did the founders put that in. Now, you're seeing a lot of revisionist history from practitioners of the Marxist, oriented critical race theory that claim, I think completely ahistorically, that the Second Amendment was put in to help empower Southern states to prevent slave revolts or to prevent slaves from escaping north. There's no evidence in the historic record that this is the case. And in fact, what's fascinating to me is you can look at the early years in Reconstruction after the Civil War, and then look at the trajectory that gun laws took in the South to know that the early restrictions passed on gun ownership in the South were aimed completely at freed Black Americans and preventing them from defending themselves against the KKK and other political terrorists. And so if you look at the Second Amendment, there's a couple of things going on there. The first, of course, is that because we're, again, created in God's image and we have natural rights, one of those natural rights that goes to the very essence of being a human is the right to self-defense. And then things get a little more complicated, because if you look again at the founding and you see, for example, Shays' Rebellion, which almost toppled the government of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1786 and led directly to the passage of the Constitution, by the way. The concern was that if you have an overly tyrannical government, that a check on that governmental tyranny would be a well-armed and regulated militia. Now, what the founders were thinking of probably wasn't as dramatic as overthrowing the government, but rather having in the back of the government's mind that if they got too tyrannical, the people would have the last recourse. And that check in the back of their mind probably tempered many a government action. And I think the other thing that people in modern times don't understand or don't realize is the concept of what a militia is. Now, many states still have in their military code definitions of the militia that would probably shock a lot of your viewers. So, for example, in left-wing California, which I left only 10 years ago, I was vice chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee for quite some time, and that had policy jurisdiction over the National Guard, where I also served as an officer. And what a lot of people don't understand or perhaps don't appreciate is in many states, you look at these military codes and it defines what the militia is. And in the case of California, it's all able-bodied men who owe allegiance to the state of California and to the United States of America from the ages of 18 up to, I believe, 45, could be 55. I forget a little bit whether it goes to 45 or 55. Then it has a couple of very narrow exceptions. It has exceptions for, I think, for conscientious objectors. It has exceptions for certain types of naval, captains. And I think there's also an exception for certain types of clergy, but again, very narrowly drawn exceptions. And so what that means then is you're reading this code is that the organized militia in the state of California is what I was in. I was in the Army National Guard, and then California, like Texas, also has a state guard, and so that's the organized militia. The unorganized militia were all those men who owed allegiance to the United States from age 18 on up to the upper limit. Men who may never have served, right? That was the unorganized militia. And so what that meant was legally, if California was threatened by invasion or some emergency, that allowed the state to simply say, hey, you're in the militia, come with me. We got something to deal with here. Kind of like how sheriffs would create posses to go off and apprehend criminals back before we had large professional law enforcement agencies. So it's in that context, then, if you look at the Second Amendment, that back in the founding and in many state codes today, the law, the definition of militia goes far beyond people who've actually received formal military training and have served in the military.
Yeah, wow, that's so much fun. I have to tell you, that's so much fun to listen to. When you were talking about it, it reminded me of kind of like the Wild Wild West, in the sense that you would have, like you mentioned, the sheriffs kind of form these groups to help keep the mayor, and maybe then the mayor, in check. Or sometimes you would have an outside group come into a town. We're talking about 1800s, come in and keep the sheriff, for instance, maybe in check. So there's a lot of elements here where you've kind of had a check on a form of government along the way, right? So we've always had, it seems like, a citizen-led check in some form or fashion. And I think what the Second Amendment helps to do is formalize that, because I think I give the Founding Fathers a lot of credit here. I think they had the vision and the foresight to see how big the government could have gotten. And in that vision, they're like, okay, if it does get bigger, or if it does get big, then we're going to have a check and balance. And it can't be the Congress, it can't be Congress or the Senate, it can't be the Justice Department, it's got to be the people. And I think giving that power back to the people, or keeping it with the people, is so vitally important, so it stays in the back of their mind. And so, in Europe,
I think there's,
okay, go ahead.
If I could, I think there's another check too that people have forgotten about largely, that we hope to revitalize at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You mentioned the check between the House and the Senate, for example, the fact that we have a bicameral system, and in fact, so does every state except Nebraska, which is the odd state out with a unicameral legislature. So yes, there is a check within the legislative function at the federal level between one chamber and the other. Initially, of course, the Senate was there to represent states and their interests, because states, generally the legislatures, would appoint those senators. And then of course, the House of Representatives was popularly elected. And then, of course, you have a further division of power with an executive branch and a judiciary. And again, all of this was done to, as the founders said, to set ambition against ambition, with the theory being that as people could be evil and ambitious and conniving, that you're going to set up this government so that it kind of works against itself to prevent that concentration of power that's injurious to liberty. Now, by the way, Woodrow Wilson did not like that. He attacked the Constitution, and he said that based on Darwin's studies of evolution, that this was ridiculous, that any organism that had its organs set up in opposition to itself would soon die, that organism could not thrive and survive. And I suppose that's correct if you're talking about an organism, but we're talking about a government, and we don't necessarily want that government to thrive and get giant. But Woodrow Wilson saw it differently, as did the early progressives and certainly the progressives today. But there's one more check that is often forgot about, in that in our federal system, not only do we have the three branches, but we also have the national and the state governments. And the state governments have their own powers. I think it's very important, by the way, to refer to states as having powers, not rights, because governments are inherently incapable of having rights. Only people have rights. Governments have powers. And so when you have the system that we do, this federal system, where there is supposed to be a significant role for state governors and legislators and the judiciary to manage their own affairs. And of course, we've seen that significantly eroded in the last 70 to 80 years with things like essentially allowing the Commerce Clause to become far more powerful than it was ever intended to, as well as demolishing the non-delegation doctrine. The non-delegation doctrine is something that says that we have a Congress, and the Congress is supposed to pass law and be accountable to the people for the laws they pass, and that we're not supposed to have Congress empowering these large bureaucracies composed of unelected technocrats who then can draft regulations that have the same force of law as law, and by the way, are then executed and enforced by the same bureaucracy. And if they accuse you of violating it, guess what? They're the ones that get to adjudicate, unless, of course, you manage to get it into a courtroom. And so the founding fathers would be completely aghast at what's happened here, where Congress has now managed to avoid any semblance of direct responsibility by empowering literally millions of bureaucrats to make decisions that go into a lot of detail. That frankly, if it was ever debated on the floor of the House or the Senate, probably never would have passed. And so these are things that we need to fight to recover, to allow our elected representatives to fully have responsibility for the rules and the laws that we live under in this nation, as well as to restore the states to their proper place as having a significant share of the power in this nation that is now, unfortunately, all too often taken by the federal government for itself.
So let me ask you then, what can people do using the tools in the Constitution, not to be entitled? We've already made that distinction. But what can people do using the tools in the Constitution to help restore the power to the states, better accountability to the federal level? I mean, it might start locally. I don't know. What would you say would be the best approach?
Well, I think there's a multitude of approaches. I mean, first of all, be involved in groups like the one you're affiliated with. Secondly, take a little bit of time, maybe watch one less ball game and learn a little bit more about what's going on in your local school district or your local county, or what's your state representative or senator up to, or your member of Congress, and let them know how you feel. The other thing is that you can accomplish a lot when you're part of a group. So in the case of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we have a public interest law firm. We call it our Center for the American Future. And it's engaged in a number of lawsuits, some of which are aimed squarely at things like the non-delegation doctrine and the Commerce Clause. And in fact, we won a lawsuit so far. I think we're at the Fifth Circuit Court where we've won, that struck the illegal, the unconstitutional moratorium on evictions that was put out by the Centers for Disease Control under first under President Trump and then reiterated under President Biden. And the Centers for Disease Control doesn't have the authority to tell landlords that they have to allow people to live rent-free in their homes and their apartments. That's ridiculous. That's a taking. They've literally taken people's property without compensation. That's patently unconstitutional. There's also a lawsuit that we've filed against the Biden administration's Occupational Health and Safety Administration for their unconstitutional demand that corporations, that firms with more than 100 employees have a vaccination mandate. Again, not something that OSHA has ever been empowered to do. That's not within the ambit of that federal bureaucracy, but they're doing it anyway. And so while perhaps an individual may not have the ability to have the financial wherewithal to sue the federal government, they can certainly have the right, the ability to band together in organizations of common interest and help underwrite or fund lawsuits like we're doing against the federal government. So there's a couple of examples for you right there.
Yeah, no, those are great options, and I encourage anybody listening and watching this to please get in touch with TPPF, an amazing organization with a great history, and they have some great resources, and they've been nothing but amazing, not only to set this up, but with what they're doing to fight some of the stuff, because it seems like especially conservatives and Republicans often are on the defense. We're often fighting. We're often like, okay, hold on. Let's take a step back and but it's also important to note that sometimes it's important to be on the offense. And TPPF does a great job of that. And I appreciate your leadership in the organization and for definitely your time today. So to finish this up and to wrap it up with a bow, I'm going to just circle back real fast. Entitlement is when we're taking. So if you're ever questioning whether you're being entitled with the Constitution and what it offers, ask, are you taking something from somebody? And then empowerment, are you really embracing the essence of what that right is? Freedom of speech may mean going to your council and giving testimony, going to the legislature and giving testimony, like you said, getting involved with your state and federal representatives or organizations. That's using the rights effectively. So to tie this up in a bow, going forward into the midterms and the 2024 presidential election cycle, what do you think people should be paying attention to as far as their constitutional rights are concerned? We only hit on two. It's a bit different than that, and we know that. But what should we be focused on going in? What should we have our antenna up for? What should we be looking for?
What I think is happening right now, and it's really kind of hitting a supercharger, is whenever the government spends money, either money extracted from us through taxation or money that is borrowed from us and our future generations, or money that if people aren't stepping up to borrow, to purchase those treasury securities, it's essentially the money printers going brr, and creating trillions where previously there wasn't trillions. So the challenge, there's a big challenge that goes way beyond just the economy and way beyond the issue of inflation and the size of government. But it's this: every dollar then that is then spent by that federal government or put down to the states through earmarks is a claim on our time, on our goods and services, that then spends that money with the priority of the federal government and sometimes unelected bureaucrats who then determine how that money is spent. And that money represents our time. It represents our labor, our work. And so the more of that gets spent equals de facto a little less of our freedom and a little more of the agenda of people we may not agree with that is kind of taking over and consuming these resources for their aims, for their objectives. And so when you see then the upcoming midterms and then the 2024 presidential election, keep in mind as you hear these debates and you hear perhaps one side talking about making, quote, investments. Well, the government doesn't generate its own money. In other words, it's not like they work for a living and they're out there providing funds for the government. That money comes from us. And so when you hear a politician talk about investments, that's code for your tax money or the borrowed money from your children and your grandchildren that we're going to spend now on their priorities. Now, I don't dispute that there's a role for government, right? I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Army in the retired reserve now, right? So certainly the common defense is a customary and expected role of government. I don't think a lot of people are going to argue about that. But you start to go and look at some of these other things that they're working on that aim to fundamentally remake America. And the more money that's put into that pot, the more they're going to be able to do that with our money. And so I think that's something to just keep an eye on as you have individuals run for office and make all these promises with your money. Just, ask yourself, what are they spending it on? Where's it coming from? What's it going to do to my ability to exercise my liberty, my freedom? And in all likelihood, some of that spending might be injurious to your, not only to your freedom, but to your future prosperity.
Yeah, that is something that, it's something we need to pay attention to, because the things that they are, and for those listening that may not know what he's referring to, it's the recent infrastructure bill, or there's actually two of them, trillions of dollars, and that's going to affect everybody for decades, possibly.
I think Build Back Better is the other one, right? And there's a key within the federal government, right? So whatever the thing is that it says, its purpose is often the opposite. So Build Back Better probably doesn't have a lot of building or better. The Department of Commerce generally doesn't help commerce, it retards it. The Department of Agriculture doesn't really grow anything. It often pays people not to grow stuff. You kind of get my drift, right? So, so you should always be skeptical of the titles that are given to these things, because the title is often the opposite of what it really is doing.
Yeah, and that's our right to be skeptical, right? I mean, that's our right to that's that checks and balances. We're like, hold on just a second. And I think something that can really empower people is if they really don't believe in the direction, then they can use their right to vote and they can change things. How can people find out more about you and TPPF?
Well, TPPF is texaspolicy.com. That's our website. I'm on Twitter at Chuck DeVore. I also maintain other social media presence. I've got a Facebook page. I don't do a lot of communications with it, but I do some broadcasting on it. So certainly anything that I write. And I'm a senior contributor at the Federalist. So I have a couple of pieces pending. I've got a piece upcoming on the argument over the national divorce, whether or not we should try to go our separate ways as states. I argue no, that the union should be rescued, not thrown out. And then I have another piece about the jump in inflation that we saw a couple of days ago, and the likelihood for sustained inflation, perhaps a return to double-digit inflation that we haven't seen since the late 70s. And so I explain why that's likely. So that's going to be at thefederalist.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And folks, really check TPPF out online. Check the Federalist out online. It's like a college education. They are so thorough and so thoughtful. And I really appreciate your time today. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
And I really hope this brought some clarity for the years to come, because it's going to be I know we say this all the time, but it's going to be a very interesting couple years to come. And so it's folks like Chuck and TPPF and all sorts of folks really banding together and bringing these ideas and getting clarity and understanding the direction we need to go or defend in case, things get a little out of hand, which they're kind of on the rocks right now. Chuck, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best for the rest of this year.
Thank you.